Have y'all seen this ongoing debate on here about the ways that Europe's most famous surreal, cubist, and abstract artists, think Dali, Magritte, Picasso, Matisse, used ideas, styles, and techniques from earlier, often unnamed Black, Indigenous, Asian, and diasporic artists? So people go back and forth over whether this is appropriation, and therefore theft, or whether it is simply inspiration and appreciation. I think people having this conversation are missing some really important historic context though, so let me share. What qualifications do I have? Some, right? I have a history PhD and I work in the transition of enslavement to freedom in the United States. I grew up in Europe, which makes me a bit of an art dummy, right? I had access and paid multiple visits to some of the most famous art galleries and museums in the world, right? The Louvre in Paris, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, the National Gallery and Tate Modern Art Gallery in London, etc. You'd think that would make me good at art history, but it didn't. And that's because whenever I saw art from non-European nations, it was displayed in ways that made it clear it wasn't equal, right? I saw paintings by Rembrandt and Vermeer, which had these robust curatorial content. There were fat little booklets with biographies of the artists, the artifacts of their lives, right? This is Rembrandt's stuff in his house, just laid out in shadow boxes with alarmed glass display cases to let you know what his life was like. That's so important. But then when you get to the Benin bronzes, right, it's a room full of stuff like this that's been pilfered by antique dealers and tourists who bought them without knowing the provenance. Provenance is just a word that we use for where they came from, how they got here, right? And the context that they were created in, the origin. And because most European museums didn't have specialists in African, Asian, or Indigenous American art, despite owning large collections of it, we, the visitors, didn't really get much in the way of curation, right? No robust context, no biographies from the few artists whose names that did get passed on with those pieces, right? But most importantly, though, there was no discussion of why. To be fair, that is becoming more common now, but it still isn't the norm. It's considered more risky and kind of a new approach. What do I mean by why? If you're a museum curator and you don't have the names of the artists, tell us why, right? If you don't have a biography, explain why. Explain the forces of colonial violence that caused this piece of art to be separated from the name of the artist and the context under which it was created and used. Explain why the gallery doesn't have someone who can research this. Explain why Western experts argue about or don't know what the purpose of the object was initially, right? Be honest. Just be honest. And if you wanted to go one step further, you could repatriate the pieces and create an exhibit of what that looks like and how you did it, right? And in doing so, uphold these pieces of art as important as the Da Vinci's and the Van Goghs in your collection. What I would like every European or Western art museum to say to its guests is that the dominant forces in global society as a whole didn't start thinking about African and Indigenous cultural production as art until the decolonial period, when nations that had been colonized aligned themselves with each other and they pushed back against rule from the European empires and asserted their rights to exist autonomously, right? The way they did that culturally was to lean into what they already had instead of looking to Europe. And that's a hard task, right? Because for centuries, nations comprised of Black, Indigenous, and or Asian majorities were taught to look to Europe for the best of everything, right? The best schools, Oxford, the most civilized systems of governance, and of course I'm using that term so incredibly loosely, the best economies. Never you mind that these economies were jump-started with the wealth and the people who were forcibly extracted from Africa and Asia and exploited in the Americas. Remember, Black and brown people in colonies who held the best jobs and the most wealth were people who had proximity to Europeanness and to whiteness, right? They were incentivized to send their children abroad where those kids learned European languages and were taught that that was superior to those that they had grown up speaking back home. They read European fairy tales instead of their own, European literature instead of the writers back home. So when colonized peoples pushed back in increasingly large numbers, they rediscovered their own roots. And the people working in culture, the artists, dug into their own folklore, their own mythology, their own religion, language, and culture to create their own artistic movements. And those like Aaron Douglas, who belong to diasporic populations. A diasporic population is a population of people from one place that has relocated to many different places due to many different historic factors and is now spread out across the world, right? Like many Black people in the Americas with roots in Africa, also many Jewish people, many Irish people due to the famine. Well, these folks used more recent inspiration from their own diasporic cultures, right? That's when you get those artists like Frida Kahlo, Aaron Douglas, Jamini, whose work comes from their own culture instead of from Europe or European influence. But of course, that work still feels kind of European, right? Or what we think of as European, because European artists appropriated these same cultural elements, right? And they called it inspiration. And that's true. They were inspired by Asian, African, and Mesoamerican artistic styles, right? But today, when a famous artist is inspired by an artist who doesn't have traction, whose name people don't know, they collab with that artist, right? And then in that collab, they will tag the artist in their work, right? On social media. They ensure that the public who appreciates their art is able to access the artist who inspired their work, right? And this inspiration has the opportunity to uplift the original artist, right? So there is 1, attribution, 2, consent, 3, compensation. The 20th century Europeans did not do that, right? They went to what is called primitivist art exhibits of the 20th century, which showcased tribal masks, carvings, ritual objects, and other intricately decorated pieces of art that is important to African, to Asian, and to Indigenous American cultures, right? Past and present. Then, like ChatGPT, they balled it all together in a vat of inspiration and pulled from it at will. And you know, these European artists relished being called geniuses for being the, quote, first to think of performing art in such a way. When you belong to a wealthy, right, a wealthy and respected part of a colonizing culture, approaching the art of a colonized population in this way is theft, right? It is very similar to ChatGPT scraping up all of our work and then remixing it to spit out on command for others without our consent or without offering payment or attribution. That's theft. And I suspect that this is probably why a lot of people of European origin don't see ChatGPT as a plagiarism machine and don't have a problem with the way that it steals from artists. But it's probably a conversation for another day.